Greetings. In this video, you will hear the most interesting and scary 3 horror stories. I publish stories every day, so if you like these stories, you can subscribe so you don't lose my channel. Enjoy watching. The infection. The world didn't end with a bang. It ended with a whisper, almost imperceptible at first, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. Then, the whispers turned to screams, and the screams to silence. But it was too late by then. Jack Tanner had always been a survivor. He had lived through natural disasters, economic collapse, and even minor wars. He was prepared for anything. At least, that's what he thought, until the infection hit. It started slowly. A few isolated reports on the news, then viral videos of strange occurrences in hospitals. People were acting erratically, losing their minds, or more accurately, losing their humanity. At first, no one understood what was happening. It wasn't until the reports started flooding in from across the country that people began to realize the terrifying truth. The dead were rising. They were coming back, not as the people they once were, but as something else entirely. By the time Jack realized the severity of the outbreak, it was too late. The cities were already crumbling, overrun by the infected. Those who hadn't turned, those who were still human, had barricaded themselves behind walls, fighting for their lives, desperately clinging to what little remained of civilization. It was a hot, muggy afternoon when it all went wrong for Jack. He had been in his small, crumbling apartment, watching the news. The authorities were warning everyone to stay inside, to lock their doors and windows. It was happening. It was real. The infection was spreading faster than anyone had anticipated. And then the power went out. Jack's phone buzzed. A text from his sister, Rachel. "Jack, it's happening here. The neighbors, they're not normal. They're coming for us." Rachel lived 2 blocks away in a more residential area. Jack immediately grabbed his backpack, filled with whatever he could find: water, some cans of food, his pistol, and a flashlight. He knew the city was already a war zone, but his sister was his last remaining family, and he wasn't about to let her become one of the infected. The streets were empty when he stepped outside. The eerie silence was broken only by distant gunshots and the faint moan of something unnatural. His heart pounded in his chest as he moved quickly, sticking to the shadows, avoiding the main roads. As he reached his sister's block, he noticed the windows of every house were boarded up. The streets were completely deserted. A thick fog had rolled in, making everything seem like a nightmare. He could barely see 10 feet ahead of him. He knocked on Rachel's door, but there was no answer. He pounded harder, his pulse racing, until finally the door creaked open. Rachel stood there, pale-faced, her eyes wide in fear. Behind her, the living room was dark, save for the glow of a few candles. "Jack," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You shouldn't have come." "Where's Ben?" he asked, looking around. Rachel's face twisted in anguish. He's not the same. You need to leave, Jack. I don't think I can protect you anymore." Before Jack could say anything, there was a low growl behind him. He turned just in time to see a pale, disheveled figure stumbling towards them from the shadows. It was a man once, but no longer. His eyes were vacant, glazed over with an unnatural hunger. His skin was pale, mottled with bruises and rot. His mouth hung open, dripping with saliva, as he reached out with jerky movements. Rachel screamed, and Jack pulled her inside, slamming the door behind them. But the thing outside didn't stop. It began scratching at the door, gnashing its teeth. "That's one of them," Rachel whispered, her voice cracking. "They don't stop. They don't feel pain. They just want to feed. Jack's heart raced as he grabbed the nearest kitchen knife and motioned for Rachel to stay behind him. He knew this was only the beginning. If they didn't act fast, the whole block would be overrun. He could already hear more of them, shuffling, moaning, their footsteps getting closer. Then there was another noise, a deep, guttural growl from the back of the house. Jack motioned for Rachel to stay low as he moved toward the kitchen window. Through the broken blinds, he saw them. More figures, more zombies. They were crawling through the alley, their eyes locked on the house, as if they knew they were trapped. "We have to move. Now," Jack said, his voice barely a whisper. They ran toward the back door, but when they opened it, the world outside had changed. The alley was filled with zombies, their rotting, grotesque bodies blocking their way. They turned and tried to make it through the front door, but it was already too late. A mob of the infected surged forward, crashing against the barricade, moaning, hissing, as if they knew they had them. Jack fought with everything he had, grabbing Rachel and pulling her toward the basement stairs. But as he reached the door, he felt it. The unmistakable sensation of cold fingers brushing against his neck. It was the man from before. His grip was deathly cold as he dragged Jack into the darkness. He swung the knife wildly, but it was no use. The thing was too strong. Its teeth sank deep into Jack's flesh, and everything went black. The last broadcast. The world had fallen apart in a way that no one could have predicted. The virus spread faster than anyone could keep up, and soon the very idea of survival became a cruel joke. Infected people, some human, some barely recognizable, roamed the streets, chasing anything that moved. The ones who remained, the lucky ones, stayed hidden in bunkers, shelters, or anywhere they could barricade themselves from the horror that lay outside. But not Jake. Jake was a survivor, and he wasn't hiding. At least, not anymore. Jake had been a radio operator long before the outbreak, working the night shifts, playing old records, and keeping the airwaves alive for the handful of listeners who tuned in. Now, he found himself sitting in that same small station, surrounded by empty chairs and a silence so deep it nearly crushed him. He couldn't help but think about the irony of it all. In the before times, people would have laughed at the thought of a radio station becoming one of the few safe havens left in a dying world. But that was exactly what had happened. The station had become a refuge, a place where survivors could hear messages, learn of safe zones, and feel some shred of connection to the world that once was. But that was before the broadcast stopped. Jake's days had become a routine of loneliness. He spent his hours in the tiny, dimly lit studio, talking into the microphone like he was still speaking to an audience. Sometimes he even read news reports, though honestly the world didn't need more bad news. The infected were everywhere. It was all anyone ever heard about anymore. But then, one night, as Jake was about to end his shift and switch off the broadcast, he received a message, an encrypted signal from a station that hadn't been heard from in weeks. "I repeat, this is Station 7. We are in need of assistance. The situation is dire. They are everywhere. We cannot hold out for much longer. Please help us. If anyone is listening, please respond." Jake's fingers hovered over the dial. Station 7. That was one of the last known safe zones. And now it was under siege. He took a deep breath, trying to ignore the sick feeling in his stomach. He knew what he had to do. There was no choice. If he didn't answer, if he didn't go, they would be lost. And maybe he could find something that would give him a way out, a way to end this nightmare. He grabbed his gear and left the station. The journey took longer than expected. The streets were treacherous, overrun by the infected. The sound of groaning and shuffling echoed in every corner of the city. It felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting for him to make a wrong move. Finally, Jake arrived at the outskirts of Station 7, a building that had once been a thriving research facility. Now, it was nothing more than a shell, broken windows, rusted metal, and barricades hastily thrown together. The air was thick with the stench of decay. He crept closer, careful to avoid the shambling figures wandering the perimeter. The front door was ajar, and Jake slipped inside, his heart pounding in his chest. The interior was just as decayed, furniture overturned, papers scattered, and bloodstains on the walls. The lights flickered, casting long shadows across the floor. It was silent, too silent. "Hello!" Jake's voice trembled as he called out into the darkness. His voice echoed off the walls, but there was no answer. Suddenly, a faint noise from above, a low, guttural growl. He froze, his heart skipping a beat. Then it came again, closer this time. It was a warning, a sound he had heard before. Jake turned just in time to see the figures. They were crawling out of the shadows, their movements jerky, unnatural. The infected. They had gotten inside. They were everywhere now. His breath quickened as he backed away, his hand trembling as he reached for his weapon. One of them, the closest, was a woman. Her face was gaunt, her skin pale and mottled, her eyes wide and empty. Her mouth was open, revealing teeth that looked far too sharp for any human. She moved quickly, her body convulsing with each step. Jake didn't wait. He fired. The shot rang out, echoing through the empty halls, and the woman collapsed to the floor with a sickening thud. But there was no time to celebrate. More of them were coming. Dozens, hundreds, and they were getting closer. He ran down the hall, searching for a way to escape, but every doorway led to more infected. The walls seemed to close in on him, the stench of death overwhelming his senses. He found himself trapped in the central room, a large, open space with only one exit. In the center of the room was a large, cracked screen. It flickered to life, and for a moment, Jake thought it was just his mind playing tricks on him. Then a voice, distorted and warped, but still familiar. "Jake? Jake, if you can hear me, we need to talk." It was Dr. Catherine West, the lead researcher at Station 7. She was the one who had sent the original distress signal. I'm here," Jake said, his voice shaky. "I came to help. What's happening? What do you need?" Her face flickered again, her expression strained and fearful. She glanced over her shoulder, then turned back to the screen. "You need to leave, Jake. They're not just infected. They're evolving. The virus is mutating. It's turning them into something worse." Jake's stomach dropped. "Mutating?" "Yes," she said, her voice breaking. "And it's not just the bodies that change. The mind, the consciousness, it's still in there. We're all starting to hear them." Before she could say more, the screen went black. The air around him grew heavier, the sound of shuffling feet growing louder. He looked back at the hallway, and that's when he saw it. The infected weren't just roaming anymore. They were organized, they were waiting, and they were coming for him. The silent horde. It was the quiet that got to her first. Samantha had always hated silence. It was never a peaceful kind of quiet. It was the unsettling kind, the kind that hinted at something lurking just beneath the surface. Something waiting. The kind of quiet that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. She hadn't been able to find anyone for days. Days that felt like weeks. The streets of the city, her city, were eerily empty. The infected had taken it over, of course. That was obvious. But the strange part was that it wasn't just the dead that had disappeared. It was the living too. Samantha's entire neighborhood had once been filled with life. Kids playing in the street, neighbors sitting on their porches, chatting with each other, the occasional laughter echoing out into the evening air. Now, there was nothing. No sounds of cars or voices or movement. Just an unnatural stillness that made every step feel like a sin. She had heard the stories, of course, about how the infected didn't just want to kill. They wanted something else, something far worse. They were evolving, mutating, becoming more intelligent, more strategic. But it hadn't hit her until now, until she was standing in the middle of her street, staring at an empty block that should have been full of life. She had been looking for survivors, for anyone who was still holding on. She'd crossed the city, seen the horrors, witnessed the breakdown of everything she had once known. It was a death trap, a nightmare, made real. And now, here she was wandering alone through it all. She was about to give up hope when she heard it. A soft, rhythmic sound. At first, it was almost imperceptible, just the faintest thud like footsteps in the distance. Samantha stopped in her tracks, listening closely. The sound wasn't coming from one direction. It was all around her. She froze. Her eyes scanned the darkened streets, her heart pounding in her chest. The air smelled stale, like decay. A cold wind blew through the street, sending a chill down her spine. Then she saw it. It was subtle at first, just a flicker in the corner of her eye. A movement, a shadow, darting between the buildings. But as her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she saw more of them. Dozens, maybe more. They were watching her. The infected weren't just wandering mindlessly anymore. They were waiting, lurking, hidden in the dark corners of the street. They were still, as if they knew she was there, silent, patient, their hollow eyes following her every move. Samantha's breath caught in her throat. She knew what this meant. They had learned. They weren't just the mindless monsters she had seen before. No, this was something else entirely, something far more dangerous. She turned to run, but it was too late. A hand shot out from the shadows, grabbing her by the wrist. She screamed, struggling to break free, but the grip was too strong. The figure pulled her into the darkness, its breath hot and fetid against her skin. She kicked and punched, but her strength was no match for the zombie's inhuman strength. Then it whispered, "Not yet." Samantha froze. The words were clear. They were human words. The zombie's face was twisted in a grotesque mask of decayed flesh, but its eyes were still there, still human. For a moment, the creature's grip loosened, and she gasped for air. She could barely make sense of what was happening. Was it talking to her? Was it trying to communicate? Another figure emerged from the shadows, this one different, taller, more imposing. Its movements were deliberate, calculated. It looked at her, and for the first time, Samantha saw something more than hunger in its eyes. There was intelligence there, something ancient and unsettling, something that had survived far longer than she had. "Stay still," the creature said, its voice raspy and dry. "They're coming." Samantha's mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. The infected had always been a mindless horde, feeding on anyone they could catch. But now, this was something else. These weren't just zombies. They were organized, strategic. They were planning something. She didn't know what, but she knew it wasn't good. She was dragged further into the shadows, her heart pounding in her chest. The creatures moved with purpose, each one watching her closely. The silence was suffocating. There was no noise except for their slow, deliberate movements. And then the whispers. "She's here," one of them muttered. The last one, "We need her." Samantha's mind reeled. What were they talking about? What did they need her for? And then it hit her. The infection wasn't just turning them into mindless killers. It was changing them, evolving them. They had become something far more terrifying than the usual shambling monsters she had fought before. They were adapting, learning, becoming smarter, and she was part of their plan. She struggled against their grip, but the more she fought, the stronger they seemed. She could hear more of them gathering around her, the air thick with the smell of rot and decay. The leader, if it could even be called that, motioned for her to stop struggling. Its eyes glinted with something she couldn't quite place. "You've been chosen," it said, its voice low and chilling. "Chosen?" Samantha whispered. "Chosen for what?" The creature didn't answer. Instead, it turned and walked toward a crumbling building in the distance, the others following. Samantha had no choice but to follow them, her heart pounding in her chest, the weight of the unknown pressing down on her. What had happened to the world? What had happened to the infected? They had learned. They had evolved. And she was about to find out exactly how much.